Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's App, a space for Asian American progressive voices in California. This will be the last episode before we go on hiatus. Today we have Lucy Shen, who's going to talk about what's up with youth and mentorship in the Asian American community.
Thanks for having me on. Yeah,
no problem. So, Lucy Shen ran for the ADEM 25th District, as well as the Fremont Unified School District School Board.
Yeah.
I think from what I've gleaned from her resume and her profile, she's a pretty prolific software engineer. So, I hope we can learn more about what she does and how that affects the youth. And I'm really interested in the stuff that she's done with Girls Who Code.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and a couple other projects like that. So I'm joined here today with my co-host, Rex Lay.
Hi.
Hi. And on that note, feel free to take it away, Rex.
Well, our opening question will be, who is your favorite historical figure from the culture you identify with?
Yeah. So I consider, I'm Chinese American. So my family, my mom and my dad are both from Shanghai, although their families hail from different parts of China. But I confess to not knowing a whole lot about Chinese history, to be honest. But I do remember once upon a time on another podcast, I'm a big podcast buff also.
Nice.
There was it This American Life? I don't know. One of the big podcasts brought up the history of the so-called pirate queen, whose name is Zheng Shi. And I just remember her being such a badass, but then I never actually looked into more of what she did. I do just remember that she basically did whatever she wanted and the government couldn't tell her to do anything without her actively going against what they wanted her to do. So that's what stayed with me. And I fully intend to read up on it more, but that's all I got.
That's pretty impressive. Isn't it in Chinese culture where women are kind of frowned upon in a way?
Yeah. So the Chinese phrase is 重男轻女, which is just that it literally translates to valuing men and not weighing, men have more weight and women have no weight. It's the very literal translation of that.
Terrible.
And it definitely, it persists to this day, but I think in a kind of an odd way. For example, if you think about the way that the percentage of women in China who work, for example, working women, they have the US beat on that metric, right? So in many ways, it's let's just say that the Cultural Revolution did some interesting demographic things when it came to women's equality in society. And so there are still some things that have carried over from pre-Cultural Revolution times, but the Cultural Revolution itself was a huge course corrector when it came to gender equality in China. But yeah, definitely the old traditions of 重男轻女 still persist quite a bit, which is why Zheng Shi has such a fun, I don't know. It's such an interesting character to me. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
It was all when you look her up, it's all she terrorized the China Sea. It's a really dramatic.
That's so cool because honestly, I'm not a big fan of. Actually, I detest Disney. Rex loves Disney, but the whole Mulan thing where you have to pretend to be a man to be empowered. Oh god, why can't we have this story? And I really bring this up because honestly, from my experience, women in coding is still kind of not as prevalent and as on equal footing as the typical white male that is your supervisor or your boss in the coding organization. Think of the people that have at the top of all these companies, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, Google, Microsoft, whatever. It's always this white man. And so I don't know.
The first and most influential programmers, the one who brought us to space even, were Black women.
Literally the original programmers, the people who invented programming as we know it today, were those women at NASA.
Yeah, exactly.
They created modern programming, and yet here we are. The history of how we got there is also pretty interesting, right? The shift in thinking over originally the idea was that programming was really sort of a rote task, anyone could do it.
Yeah.
Therefore, obviously women should be the ones who do it. And then over time, as people realize that it's so much more challenging and it actually takes a lot of logical thinking and procedural skills, and then they were like, oh, well, then in that case, it's a man's job. Like as the thinking shifted on like what programming is, then the job also, in terms of who did it, would also change. Yeah.
I actually think it's a little bit more like malicious, where as programming became more powerful, it kind of
profitable
way and profitable. But
I see.
like it became more like, oh yeah, we can use this as a different way to do calculations on how to drop bombs or I don't know, whatever.
Oh boy, it's a very literal power.
Yeah, I mean that's a very literal interpretation. So that begs the question: why are you so passionate about education and mentorship, especially is it really relates to coding too, or just in general?
Mm-hmm. I think just in general, honestly, but the way it has manifested for me has very much been in coding, right? Just because that's sort of the area I inhabit, and it's the area where I have the most value to like offer to my mentees. But yeah, I think that's just what naturally has occurred for me. But in general, I've always really enjoyed teaching, specific like the act of teaching as a way of sort of deepening my own understanding of a subject. Because I realized that like teaching somebody a subject is when I was truly challenged to like thoroughly understand the ins and outs of something. Mm-hmm. And that was the moment at which I truly understood or grasped the concept, was when I was teaching it to somebody else. And so for selfish reasons, I really enjoy teaching, but also part of it is, I recently read Adam Grant's book, Give and Take. And in the book, he describes a lot about like the whole book's focus is about the fact that people are generally categorized into givers or takers or matchers. And some people are sort of like naturally predisposed to giving, but that based on certain cultural norms that you set and like society and the way society moves and happens, that people can sort of be shifted or pushed in one direction or another. And so in the workplace, for example, most people end up as matchers. But for me, teaching is definitely an act of giving. And after reading that book, I realized that I did definitely default more to the giving side for sure, where I derived a lot of my personal satisfaction and reward from like the act of giving things to other people in a way that is like sustainable, right? So that the thing that gives me joy more than anything else is when I give into a system that is sort of like naturally giving onward. So like it's paying it forward in a way. And I can't always see that happening, but the feeling of knowing that I'm giving to somebody who will continue to pass things on is what brings me the most sense of reward. And education and teaching and mentorship is like one huge way and very obvious way you can do that, right? Because generally speaking, in my experience, the people that I've mentored have gone on to be mentors for other people. And so even if I may never directly come into contact with my like grand mentees or whatever, it's still a valuable experience. Like you're giving back into a network that has also given to you. And so you're part of like a longer, larger narrative. And it just like makes you feel less like you're just a small organism floating on a rock in the middle of a vast universe, like to feel more interconnected with the people around you. Yeah. I in the end, it's this sort of chain or web of giving that makes education and mentorship so valuable to me.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, me working at UCLA and actually before then in India, a lot of my belief is that if we ever are in positions of knowledge, it's always important to share that knowledge, because I see that as a privilege, and it's your responsibility to take that privilege and kind of distill it, not in a sense that like we know what's best, but in a sense like this is what's available. And I was
like we're sharing into a pool of knowledge that everybody's taking out of, right? Is that sort of like the end goal? Yeah, exactly.
And then I mean, for me, it's also fighting back against this notion of all these tools being used to oppress, because in my opinion, these tools can be tools of oppression. And so by giving it back to the community is really trying to strengthen the foothold against these tools that come into the community and really try to tell the narrative.
Get the youth out.
Yeah, get the youth out, or like
or put them in a pipeline.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. Because I mean, one of my most rewarding experiences in India was teaching like mapping and GIS and Google Earth to like kids in like basic squatters settlements, and they had a lab, and I was like, hey, look, this is you on the planet, and making sure that they walk away with the knowledge that like what Earth is and how people collect this data and what it means for you is really up to you and your story. It's not somebody else's data to tell. And that's kind of been my modus operandi. So I agree that sharing this pool of knowledge is really important, because it really makes us better at what we do, and it really allows us to kind of like hone our skills. Because like, yeah, I agree with you too. Like, I like to teach because it helps me make sure I know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with that 100%. But I also have the other aspect where it's like, okay, we should always be continually trying to push others to this, like whatever field it is, whether it's programming, whether it's like
it's about eroding the barriers to access, right? Because the barriers themselves that's the oppression like mechanic.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going for. So thanks.
Where was the origin of the network, the learning network that came down to you?
Oh, that's a good question. I think I have just always operated on, I guess for me, a lot of it goes back to like alumnus circles. I like feel deeply connected to all the schools that I've attended for some reason. I honestly didn't really have the best pre-college experience in terms of like the schools that I went to. It was a little bit chaotic. My family was back and forth between here and Shanghai as I was growing up. So my educational experience was very disjointed and a bit chaotic. It was hard for me to put down roots in the beginning. And I think that's why as high school unfolded and I was finally able to like stay at a school for 4 years straight, that I really valued like the connections that I built in those circles. And then I went on to, I don't think I realized at the time how impactful like my high school experience was to me. I thought it was just sort of like a mildly traumatic experience that I could leave behind me that like maybe I'd made some good friends out of, right? Like trauma bonding. But I went on to college to a school that I specifically chose because it had such a powerful alumnus network. So no shade to UCLA, but UCLA was one of my dream schools actually. And I did get in and I was like fully ready to go to UCLA, but I ended up choosing Wellesley College because it had such a strong, like tight knit alumnus community that I really just like was not witnessing in any of the other schools that I was even considering. And I don't know.
3 Bruins.
We could have had 3 Bruins in this podcast. That's true. But yeah, that choice to go to Wellesley was driven largely by like what I was seeing in the alumnus network. And for some reason I was just drawn to that in a way that was like impactful enough that it made me choose a school I had barely even considered over a school that I had considered my dream school, which was UCLA. And it turned out to be very true. Like in the years since then, as I've attended Wellesley, there's like a saying that Wellesley alums would say to us when we were students, which was Wellesley gets better after you graduate. And as students, we were like, what does that mean? But as an alum now, I realize it means that Wellesley itself was a really, honestly, very trying experience. The gauntlet we ran it. It was a very grade deflation-y,
really
stressful place. Yeah, definitely. We came out of that with like the strongest possible network I've ever seen in terms of alumni. Like for example, I'm part of an alumnus circle, I guess we call it. So it's kind of like if you've heard of like lean-in circles, which I guess Sheryl Sandberg kind of popularized. I don't personally I have complicated feelings about lean-in circles, but our alumnus circle is sort of focused on just like a set of intergenerational people who come from different industries and backgrounds and et cetera. And we just meet once a month. And the one thing we have in common is that we all went to Wellesley. And like that in and of itself is enough to unite us, despite the fact that we're all super different people. And we've continued this circle we're going into our 4th year now. So I don't know, it's just pretty wild to me that like a connection that seems so arbitrary could be so powerful. But that is these sorts of alumnus networks these are now what drives me the most, I guess, because now I'm thinking about the mentorship work that I am thinking of driving in the coming year that I'll be trying to focus on more is spinning up a mentorship network for our high school alums, because I realized through running my school board campaign and our campaign was largely powered by the fact that like so many people had moved back home because of the pandemic. Whereas previously that just wasn't the case. Like there weren't a whole lot of people who were back in our hometown. And so any organizing work we were doing here largely did not involve people that I knew in high school, but rather people I met outside of that in the community. But when it came to my campaign, everyone was willing and able to show up because they were all home for the pandemic. So that was a shock to me, but I realized for the first time that like it was possible for us to try and build a more robust network of some kind for our alums that just doesn't exist at all currently. So I was hoping that mentorship would be something that would draw people in and keep them connected to each other. Because I realized during my campaign that like I was saying that I wanted to, speak for our current students and like try to make their experience better than what I had. As I mentioned, we had a lot of trauma. So trying to make a more healthy learning environment for our current students. And I was saying that, but at the same time, I didn't know a whole lot of current students. Like I only knew a few, maybe like 5 personally. And I would not consider that a very strong connection to our current students. And I was hearing the same thing from our volunteers who were all also like alums of either my high school or like the neighboring high schools in Fremont. So I don't know. It seemed like infrastructure that we were missing. And so that's something that I want to also invest in now as someone who like sees the gap. And so I realized like, as you asked this question, it's not something I've thought about before, but I guess a lot of my sort of giving back to what gave to me, the question of like who gave to me first is really these different alum networks that I've been part of. Yeah.
Yeah. So would you say you're closer to your Wellesley alums more than the high school?
It's actually, I think it's pretty equal. I think the Wellesley alums have more infrastructure and support because it's been ongoing for so long. We have like very formal systems of like local alum clubs, for example, that we pay dues to. And then they organize fun events for us. Like this is something that's like systemically supported. And it's also like encouraged and backed largely by our college as well, because it's part of their brand, right? Like obviously it worked on me. It was enough to convince me to go. So since it's working for them, it's something that they value and invest in, but it's not something that currently is bringing our school district, my high school, at least my high school's alums are not bringing my school district any like tangible returns currently. Like we're not really like donors to the school, for example. They don't even really have like, it's a public school system, right? It doesn't like the donations they depend on are largely divorced from their alum networks. That's just a whole thing we don't even tap into currently.
How do you think your life would have like benefited or changed differently if our school, me and Lucy are both from Fremont, by the way, if our schools had given us access to the mentorship you have access to right now?
Yeah. So the ideal state, right? Sorry for the engineering talk that's coming out right now. The ideal state of the mentorship network that I'm hoping to build is really to create a system of like sort of generations of mentors, so that people who are several generations divorced from current students can still feel like there's a pathway leading them back. And I feel like if I were on the receiving end of that, originally when I was still in high school, that I would have had so much more perspective beyond the bubble of our high, because our high school was such a tense, stressful, traumatic bubble where we just had no perspective to the fact that none of the things that we were stressed about were going to matter in the long run. Like we were so hyper fixated on getting into, I don't know, an Ivy League school. Like it was just like these weird fixations that, I don't know, it must have been that we were raised that way or like something about the culture of the school. There was just a stress culture, like weird competitive tendencies for us to be like, oh yeah, like, haha, I got 2 hours of sleep last night. Oh yeah, well, I got half an hour of sleep last night. Like weird toxic standards, I guess, that were just normalized because we had no visibility into other ways of existing. So like other value models, right? Like our only value model that we had access to was this like very meritocratic, like Hunger Games-y kind of environment. We viewed everything as a zero-sum game. Like if you got an A on this test, then that means the curve is going to work against me, you know? So these kinds of like pitting people against each other, this culture of pitting people against each other was what we were raised under. And I feel like if I had access to somebody who, perhaps somebody like me, right? So someone who had graduated at this point, oh my God, I don't even want to do the math. Almost 8 years ago from high school, and went to college on the opposite coast and then like worked for a few years and ended up following a career path that high school me could never have imagined. Like I never thought I would end up in software. If I had access to somebody like this on a regular basis, let's say once a month or once every 2 weeks, just to talk to on a casual basis, I feel like I would have a much more open-minded view of like all the different ways my life could have unfolded, no matter how I seem to have screwed up on my, I don't know, AP bio exam last night, you know? All of these, the way that the awareness that life is larger than like our little bubble in high school. I think that's what I was missing. And I don't know if that continues to be true for our current students, but if it is, that's something that I would love to help them balance a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also plays into mental health in some way too, where
Absolutely.
Like important grounding realization that, you know, the education is traumatic in some respects. And part of it, I think, is, I mean, I don't know how much it is the Asian culture of, you know, valuing education, et cetera, and how much of it is the Western notion of like what it means to be educated. Because, you know, in places like Japan, where you have like cram schools and all these other things to get into good high schools and colleges, it's like, you know, a competitive merit-based thing as well. But, you know, it's very much, I think, a Western notion of like, okay, what does it mean to be successful?
Right. Yeah. And the American dream of like pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. Like, it doesn't matter how low you start. It only matters how hard you work and like how far you can take yourself by your own sheer willpower. Right. It's this like fake narrative that you can, the American individualistic take of like, you can depend solely on yourself and just like grind yourself down to the bone and that will automatically equate success. Like, we know that that's not true. Now we do, I guess, but as a high schooler, that's not at all something I was aware of. And you also bring up a good point, right? Which is that like my high school bubble had this experience, but we were a really weird high school. Like we were like 87% Asian when I went, and also like very affluent. I am from a very affluent neighborhood. And so other schools that are also under the Fremont Unified School District did not have my experience, actually. Like, I remember preparing for my campaign and finding out that like almost a third of students at one of the high schools in our city, almost a third of the students there were on the like free and reduced price lunch plan. Like they had that support because they needed it. And that was not something that I ever thought. Like 1/3 was not a number I would have ever guessed if you asked me to guess before I started preparing for this campaign. And at that moment, I realized that like my viewpoint was still very, very, very stuck in like my very specific personal experience in our high school system and in my specific high school.
Right.
That a mentorship program that spans the city could really help us better connect all of these little silos that exist within the city, because we are geographically segregated still along like socioeconomic lines, basically. So I feel like a more intentional, carefully planned mentorship framework could maybe help us overcome some of those barriers, and also help, again, erode the barriers a bit so that we have a more equitable educational system.
Yeah, I agree.
Just by virtue of it being more interconnected. Yeah.
I remember being on the free and reduced lunches.
I mean, it's interesting because actually, Lucy, your experience is exactly the same as my experience in high school. Majority Asian, a lot of people want to go to Ivy League, curved grading, blah blah. And actually, full disclosure, like I was basically really anti-education growing up.
Wow, look at you now, though.
I mean, when you're talking about paths, it's like, you would not want me teacher? That's ridiculous.
It's just all propaganda. Now he's part of the system.
Well, I mean, it's funny because I took a year off of school because I hated school. After
was this in college or
before
after high school?
Because I
see. It's like a gap year.
Yeah, gap year. Actually, I wanted to be an artist, a musician, so I was like writing music and stuff.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's awesome, but my bandmate left me, so I was like, oh. But anyways, yeah, so my experience was, all right, you know, if I'm going to be doing something like related to art, and it's not going to pan out well, then okay, I need to go back to school, at least figure out what's the next alternative. And that's where I went to SF State as my kind of go-to school for environmentalism. But I also I studied film because okay, full disclosure, I grew up with these like groups of people making like anime music videos, and
yes, this is my culture. Oh my god, everything you're saying, I'm like, are you me? Like, I went through the exact same path.
But it seemed very much like that culture of the competitiveness and just being able to express oneself is always at odds, right? Because it's basically the capitalist regime versus trying to battle against progressive ideas, and in my opinion, like I would call it socialist ideas, because things like public education, just general things, post office, roads, those are all public goods that are socialist in nature. But
right, yeah. It's just that like for some reason we've been taught to think of socialist as a bad word, and so
exactly.
like it feels like a very loaded word when you choose to use it. Yeah.
But mentorship was like how people originally like passed on knowledge. Not everyone could afford huge classroom
like apprenticeship.
settings.
Yeah.
It's apprenticeship back then. That was how people did it. And because not everyone could afford classrooms and private tutors.
Yeah. And like mass communications are a totally different thing now also, right? Like pre the printed word, even like apprenticeship was your only way to learn anything. Yeah.
Especially, I mean, now that you mentioned too, with how students are doing nowadays in the, school districts that you ran for and just in general, like everything being remote is also kind of like a completely different change, I think, in terms of how
and it was so sudden, right? We had no time to prepare for it.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think that Zoom bombing and all these other stuff is very much like, I mean, if you think about how I honestly, for me, education is just crazy because like you have these school shootings, you have all these like things bundled into it that it really feels like resources are just concentrated in certain places and deconcentrated in others to create
absolutely
unequal, kind of like American dream struggle where like if your like skin color is black, oh, you're gonna have a much harder time to
that's life in hard mode, like come on.
And I mean that's all I have to say about that, but
that's a whole other conversation. Yeah,
exactly. Sure. I think you did touch on your ideal model of youth mentorship, right? Or did you want to
well, that it basically goes back to what I was saying earlier about like having a network that gives into itself or has a culture of giving, right? So the giving compounds on itself. And that's what makes giving sustainable. Honestly, I'm kind of just quoting from Adam Grant's book at this point. Really good book, big recommend. But it's basically just the idea that like, if you're a giver, the dangerous trap that you can slip into is that you give until you have nothing left, right? And people keep saying like, oh, you got to fill your own cup first, et cetera, et cetera. But for a lot of givers, the way you fill your cup is by giving. So how do you give in a way that fills your cup instead of draining it? Is the core question there. And the answer that Adam proposes and that I do like deeply resonates in my soul is that you give in a way that continues to give without you having to constantly continue giving, right? So because the giving compounds on itself, you only have to give a little bit and you see it like multiply. And that's the magic of it. And if that's where you're getting your energy from, then you're also automatically filling your own cup. So that is sort of my ideal model, not just of mentorship, but of any community, is that it's like a community that encourages and values givers and giving behaviors. And that's why like it's okay for some takers and some matchers to exist in communities like that, because when the norm is to give, then even takers and matchers will do that. Yeah.
It's kind of like the reverse of the tragedy of the commons, right?
It is the exact reverse of the tragedy of the commons. Yeah.
Yeah. And Rex, are you familiar with that term?
I am familiar with that term, but it's one of those terms that gets thrown all around so much by everyone who's like opposed to
yes. Yeah. The tragedy of the commons thing for me in my brain is for some reason it's a very specific visual of like a meadow.
Yeah, me too. The cows grazing.
And there's cows. Yeah,
exactly.
I don't know why. It's like such a specific mental image.
Seriously. Yeah, go ahead. Go. You can explain it to Rex.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I guess not just for Rex, but for any listeners who might not know the tragedy of the commons. Yes. Imagine that you are living in a village society where everyone is like a farmer and you have cows and there's a village meadow that nobody owns. It's a public good. And so you can graze your cows on that meadow as much as you want. And so what happens is people just like get their cows to graze as much as possible and get more cows because the food for the cows is free. And then eventually the meadow has no more grass on it and it's dead because everybody has like sort of seeped as much as they possibly could out of what seems to be a free resource instead of like sustainably continuing it. So that's sort of the tragedy of the commons. And we see it manifest in our day-to-day lives all the time. In terms of like the free rider problem is usually how it shows up. Yeah.
Yep.
So
so does that explain a little bit more, Rex?
Yeah. No, but it's I've always heard it as like either pro either anti-progressive ideas.
Yeah, it is.
People would throw it
definitely.
out as like, this is what happens if
Yeah.
you switch to like socialism. Everyone's just gonna be freeloaders.
Well,
Or
Yeah.
as like pro-authoritarian ideas where if you don't regulate the people, they are gonna be stupid and just exhaust the resources. So we have to have centralized distribution.
Yeah.
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 I mean, okay, so full disclosure, Lucy, I chose to go to UCLA only because of one professor.
Oh, valid.
And literally it was Donald Shoup. So if you've never heard of Donald Shoup before,
Mm-mm.
he's the guy. Everyone who's on this podcast, please look at Donald Shoup. He is a legend. He basically he's an urban planning professor that wrote the book, The High Cost of Free Parking, or the it's basically about
I see it.
how parking is actually the tragedy of the commons, and we can easily adopt any economic policies to retrieve that public good of parking on a open like public space.
Interesting.
His methodology of teaching about how we can leverage, like, basically if you put the authoritarian things that Rex is talking about in place and visibly reinvest that in the community right immediate to wherever these parking spots are or these meadows are, then the complaints are very minimal, because it's like, oh yeah, sure, the cost of like grazing on the meadow is more expensive, but at least now we have like these fancy expanded meadow like fences that people graze in certain times. So it really drives home, just like from a purely economic and capitalistic view, that even if we adopt like progressive ideas in like a purely free market laissez-faire thing, it's actually progressive. But because we have all these stupid like quote unquote capitalist things that like, oh yeah, we're gonna subsidize farming, oh we're gonna subsidize the military industrial complex, it's actually like, and this is, I know why Bernie always comes up when I'm on the show, but this is like where it's like it's socialism, and I think Martin Luther King said something like that, where it's socialism for the rich and then rugged individualism for the poor.
Exactly. Yeah. I was just ranting on Twitter yesterday about the mortgage income tax deductions. It's the same crap. Yeah.
Yeah, no, seriously.
Yeah.
And then you have this like stimulus check that just got passed yesterday where, hey, look, if you're making more than 75,000, you get zero. And I'm like, oh, of course, because, anyone making 80,000 a year is rich in the Bay Area.
Yeah, exactly. Dear God. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I'm actually really curious about like how what's his name, Donald Shoup would think about like climate change, right? So like, for example, carbon emissions are like a very classic example of the tragedy of the commons currently, because like these externalized costs are not being accounted for. And it sounds like his thinking on parking is actually largely about externalized costs that are not being accounted for. Exactly. It's the same problem. Yeah. So
we talk about positive externalities and negative externalities.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's very much like, uses the tools of these kind of like urban planning departments and stuff against the departments, because like, we should not be, because like, places like Fremont, Palo Alto, they have what we call parking minimums, where it's like, if you build a building, you have to have a minimum number of parking spaces.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Boston has the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's dictated by white men back in the 1970s and 60s when they were coming out with this national highway book, and the freaking highway system is completely socialist because it was built in the 1940s with federal money, and people were like, this is American freedom.
Actually, this was paid for by taxpayer dollars, and taxes are socialist. So
so I mean, that's my 2 cents on that. Sorry to take you away from education, but
I don't know for sure. No, it's a fun conversation. Yeah, and it's relevant. Yeah.
But, okay. Rex.
Yes. How do you avoid, oppressing the youth while mentoring them with all these institutions? Because school is, I don't know. A lot of progressives nowadays are saying that, and I kind of see it, the schools are kind of basically centers of indoctrination rather than actual places to mentor the next generation.
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, I think the first step is to admit that you can't avoid institutional oppression. Like it's impossible because that's the system that we exist within. And if you wanted to break entirely out of it, we'd be looking at something totally different that doesn't at all look like the mentorship systems that we are used to currently as like sort of standard mentoring. And so I think the key is really to call it out in your process to recognize very explicitly with the youth that you're mentoring that like we are part of a broken system, and you and I, what we're doing here in this mentorship program is also really part of that broken system, and there's really no avoiding it. So the best we can do is the best we can do, basically. So within the boundaries of the system, what can we do incrementally for each other and for our networks so that we can try to grow beyond it? And it's obviously like it feels really weird. It's like a catch-22. What's the thing that people always say? You have to play the game to change the game. Like you have to play by the rules. I don't know how much I agree with that necessarily, in the sense that like true revolutionary change only happens when there's a goddamn revolution. Like that is not playing by the rules. But I do think that for the time being, that harm reduction has value. That's my personal belief. And I think that mentorship networks within these oppressive educational frameworks that we do exist within does inherently have value because I don't know, I guess it's all hypothetical, but for me, like this is a program that I would have, like a mentorship program that involved people who came from my high school would have been a huge help to me personally. And it's hopefully also, these are things that I would have continued to pass on also. And I am, right? Like I received a lot of help from a mentorship network that does exist in my college network, and I'm trying to give it back to my high school now. So I'm hoping that I wouldn't consider it like institutional reform in any way. I do think that we are still sort of operating under the modus operandi of like this institution. Yeah. But I think there are things we can do better within those boundaries. And I think that's worth the energy that we put into it. Like it's one thing to say that the system is broken and then to do something to change the system or to do something to improve things within the system. But what I usually witness is people saying the system is broken and then they like sit back and don't do anything. The system is so broken, like I can't do it. And like I understand how that can make you feel trapped, right? That you're looking at the system, it's so incredibly broken. Where do I even start? What could I even possibly do to change anything if it's like this broken? But I feel like in many ways it's just defeatist and it's not contributing anything. And I would rather be doing something that at the very least is not harming anyone, and at the very best could be improving a lot of lives and experiences. So
the system wasn't built in a day, and neither was the system that it overthrew. Exactly.
Yeah, and when time comes for revolution, I'm hoping that I'll be able to be on the right side of history. But until then,
I'll be on the left side of history.
It will be what's left.
Oh no!
Definitely, Lucy. What I think that you're kind of. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think what you're alluding to is kind of like a multi-pronged approach where, you have one approach that's within the institution, one approach that's outside the institution, and another approach that's kind of like really in the business of connecting all these things together. Push all this change that needs to happen.
The visual in my brain is always like, okay, for some reason, it's very specifically the wall from like Attack on Titan, like that thick ass wall, like a really tall, like insurmountable kind of a wall, right? And that's sort of like, these are the barriers between the institution and those who are left out of it, is kind of like how I think about it. And you need people who are both inside the wall and outside the wall to like chip away at it from both sides in order for you to reach each other.
Yeah, right.
It's a very literal interpretation, but like that's how it visualizes. And I'm just a very visual person, and that's the visualization in my brain. And the third part that you mentioned earlier actually is something I hadn't thought about too much, which is like the messengers that relay between the two. And that's also super valuable. And I realized that's actually what our organizing frameworks are. Like local organizers, that's what they're doing, right? The whole point is to like connect the people with like their governance systems. And so they're the messengers in between. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought about the third component as much before.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just think about it all the time because I find myself going between all three.
Yeah, exactly. Like you do need people who are familiar with all three roles.
Yeah. I mean, well, it's just because like, just personally speaking, my like I try to like, cause I started off really much being against the system, and I kind of like fell into this role of like, okay, maybe I can be within it. And now I'm kind of like falling out of that role of being within the system and making a change, to be more of a messenger type of thing. And I mean, this podcast is one idea where it's just like, okay, let's see what good people are doing to kind of like break these barriers down. And so, I mean, I'm glad that you were able to come by and give us some experience with that, because I do think that for me, when you say the notion of like the wall is insurmountable, if you're looking at it, it's like the fetus. It reminds me of about like techno-fascism and how this idea that machine learning is undefeatable. Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook are like huge things that cannot be destroyed. Amazon is a necessity of life. I mean, these are all notions of defeatism that I also associate with the idea that technology has just been given too much weight, and the social aspect of where technology comes into play has been kind of shoved under the rug, so that people in these technical notions of power, Twitter, Instagram, blah blah, can actually like influence the social narrative without even like lifting a finger, just because it's so overwhelming. And exactly. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you agree with that, but
no, you can. So I mean, like, you can take individual action against a system that you think is broken, right? Like even if it's purely symbolic, I still think it has value. So I mean, in my case, I'm like almost a year into my Amazon boycott. It's going pretty well. I would say that Amazon is not that big of a necessity of life after this 1 year of boycotting it. Although my family continues to insist on using it, and they think my boycott is stupid. But,
same. My sister's like, "Hey, you want this thing? It's on Amazon Prime."
Exactly. Like you can get it in 2 days, or even 1 day if you were to get it on Amazon Prime. I'm like, no, thank you. I'm going to go on eBay. Like,
COVID taught me eBay.
Exactly. Like, turns out eBay actually is really great. And I mean, what I know of the founders of eBay is like, I'm just so much more in alignment with their values than I am with Amazon's.
Yeah.
So
it's definitely more a free market approach than I think like,
and like free cycle is another option that I haven't explored as much, right? Yeah. Like that's a whole community based approach also that I feel like should be given more value. In general, like American individualism has like eroded our community mentalities in a way that like I hope is not irreparable. And I see people investing into like building it back up, and it gives me hope, but we can do better. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Fun light fact: from high school to where I am now, my political chart is like a straight diagonal.
I feel you. I feel you a lot on that. Yeah, for sure. I was fully indoctrinated into the system in high school. Yeah.
Oh, it's funny because like, I've always been this like rebel.
You've been the rebel.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because like, I mean, I don't want to say it's as a prideful thing. There's just two sides to it. Because I mean, I would do like, okay, some of the stuff I did in high school was pretty silly.
High school was like rough on me, and I hated the system as well. But I didn't have a lot of friends, and when you're an isolated cis man. You turn to the ideology that sounds the most macho.
Yeah. So then what pivoted you if you were that far out?
My sibling, honestly. My sibling went through, being like, they're not cis, so and they have different expectations from my family. So they left the house first, and they're a younger sibling, and they went through their whole political journey. And while I was still stuck in my like little isolated bubble, I did have like progressive friends and progressive teachers in college that kind of like introduced me to the concept, Albert amongst them. But for the most part, I was like still trapped in my little mind. And then my sibling just like found the opportunity, like, hey, come join this little Vietnamese progressive camp with me. And they like gave me the terms to understand what I'm going through, like intergenerational trauma. That word just like kind of like woke me up, because I never heard it used in the context of like people outside the context of like chattel slavery for Black folks.
Yeah, like it sounds like you felt like you were seen really for the first time. Yeah.
What about you, Lucy?
Yeah, it must have been my college experience for me. Just the fact that I was able to leave my high school bubble. When I say I was indoctrinated into the system, I just meant that I like fully bought into the meritocracy myth, right? So the idea that like all of my success can be wholly attributed to the fact that I myself am an incredible human being. Like, such a messed up
that way. I mean, I kind of buy into it too.
I don't know, buddy. Like since then, what I realized is I think honestly a big moment for me actually was right there in our orientation week to college. Honestly, we had Wellesley is a fancy liberal arts like private college. The tuition was sky high, so it's like it's a fancy fancy place. Although I really am proud of like how good Wellesley is about financial aid. Like we're one of the best schools when it comes to offering financial aid. Half of our students are on some kind of financial aid, which is like a huge percentage. But I was one of many fortunate students I was not on financial aid. And early on, I think very early on in orientation week, they do there's an event that happens every orientation. It's kind of a tradition now. It's called Let Me Speak. And it's like a staged production. And I think either before or after we watched those performances, the moderator did an exercise with the audience where they were like, okay, like all of you, like everybody stand up and like sit down if you like didn't have enough, like if you came from a background where like your family wasn't always sure that you'd be able to like where your next meal was coming from or whether you'd have a roof over your heads, like that there was sort of like food instability and like shelter instability in your lives. And like a certain portion of people sat down and then it's like, okay, like sit down if you feel like you led a fairly average existence in terms of your financial background, that your family was able to take, I don't know, a vacation once a year and like were reasonably able to like feed and house your parents were able to reasonably feed and house you, and another portion sat down and then like, okay, well, take a seat now. And you're looking around, you realize there are only a few people standing left. Take a seat now if you like really you come from a background where you've never had to worry about food being on the table, a roof over your heads. You took as many vacations as you wanted, pretty much, that you were capable of as a family, that like these material needs were never a concern for you. And as I was still standing and like listening to that, I realized that I came from a background of like extreme privilege, actually. And like also in that sort of like somewhat radicalizing moment in retrospect, that should not have been a background of extreme privilege. That should have been like a right that everybody who was sitting around me should have had access to. And it was just like infuriating in that moment that like what should have been such a normal, healthy existence that I had led should have been accessible by everyone who was sitting around me. It was just frustrating, I think, in that moment, and like humbling also, because it just shouldn't be that way. But it was my first like real tangible, impactful experience outside of my little affluent meritocratic high school bubble. And I realized that like so many of the people who were around me in this school had worked probably 20 times harder to get there than I ever had. It was sobering for sure. And I think that sort of catalyzed the beginning of everything that happened after that. And it's just like, meeting people who came from very different backgrounds, talking to them, becoming friends with them. I genuinely believe that like having a diverse community is what makes you more open-minded, because you just like, I think it's hard for the human brain to imagine things that it's never encountered. And so the more that you encounter, the more you're able to like imagine the crazy things that can exist outside of it. Because your like array of possibilities expands infinitely. Yeah, exactly. So that was my college experience. Yeah. So it opened my mind a lot. I mean, my parents will call it brainwashing, but I think it was the opposite. So, yeah.
I think definitely this is kind of related to the topic of today, like the balance between one's own realization and the mentorship that, places like Wellesley and other mentorship opportunities provide. Because like it's that notion of like you could bring a camel to water, but you can't make it drink or whatever. Right. It's like you have to have that kind of like introspective perspective, as well as some kind of like external thing that Rex mentioned with his sibling, or like that you've mentioned with Wellesley, like where you it's those two factors that combine to make people quote unquote awoke, or to understand that okay, things do have to change because things are broken, and being exposed to different viewpoints also kind of helps to like with that self-examination, I think, and actually with the mentorship as well. But yeah, that's what I'll say about that, I think. Any thoughts or?
No. I mean, I have nothing to add. Okay. Very accurate. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, well, I guess on that point, do you think youth mentorship within the AAPI community has to be tailored in any particular way? If so, if not, one thing I would kind of add on to this question, and you kind of mentioned it a little bit with this merit-based notion, but like how much do we have to address things like the model minority myth and all these other things?
Not just that, but that there's a great paper, I forgot who wrote it, the triangulation of like the model minority myth.
Oh,
that like the model minority myth, that paper honestly like blew my damn mind. I think I read it like 5 times just thinking about all the different ways I'd never thought about the model minority myth. Because prior to reading that paper, model minority myth to me meant that like people assumed I was good at math, you know, like it was a really like shallow understanding. And I was like, that's like, it's my perspective at the time before reading this paper was that like the model minority myth is kind of irritating. And like that's sort of where I was on it. But now I realize that like the model minority myth is like extremely deep important in enforcing white supremacy.
Exactly.
Because it triangulates you, the model minority, against the lesser minorities, which are considered, you know, like the Black and brown people. And without the existence of you as like a third party comparator, that it would be impossible to oppress Black and brown people the way that that white supremacy does. And so in many ways, like by participating and like opting into model minority, you are buying into white supremacy and supporting white supremacy as it like perpetuates and propagates.
This is why I hate like calling it a myth. It's not a myth. It's like a concerted institutional system.
Exactly. Like this was a very intentional like creation of white supremacy.
Like you can see the history of it too. It didn't exist until like the 70s when
precisely
like when
convenient
repealing the Asian exclusion like actively brought in more Asians, you know. So now they're like, oh shoot, we can't just have all these yellow, Black, and brown people uniting, because that's what they did during the civil
class
rights.
Solidarity is what leads to revolution.
Solidarity scared the hell out of them. They got to COINTELPRO that crap and then tacked on the model minority myth after.
Right, exactly. And not just that, but to reinforce the model minority myth by like specifically selecting for highly educated people from like East and South Asian countries, so that we like our tech industry is now powered entirely by East and South Asian immigrants. And like, oh yeah, these are the doctors and the lawyers and the engineers. Like they come from East and South Asia. Therefore, East and South Asian people are like categorically better in some way, because like the ones that we see here in the States are all of the highest educated, most affluent ones. Like
most of the poor people there still live in like shanty towns like Albert.
There's like a huge range of financial socioeconomic existence in East and South Asia still. It's like a much wider range actually than we see in the US.
But I will say the economic distribution is more equal than in the US.
For sure. It may be wider in range, but the distribution is a little more even.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, at this point, we're at like pre-French Revolution levels. So
instead of having cake, we're getting crumbs too.
Right, exactly.
Forget the cake. I mean, we're not going to get any of that. Oh God. But yeah, so like in terms of mentorship though, like, so how would you approach that for the AAPI community?
Well, I mean, the first thing for me is like thinking about it again as like, if I were still in high school and I had access to this kind of a mentorship program, like what would I, mentoring my past self, like what would I do? And I do think that this whole, like the fact that I still up until like 2 years ago, still thought of the model minority myth as like largely harmless. That's something that I would tackle like head on, right? That needs to be tackled head on if we do have some kind of an AAPI youth mentor. Actually, I want to pause for a moment and call it the fact that like AAPI as a concept is a little bit screwed.
It is.
Like as a category, a little bit random. Like, why are Pacific Islanders in here? I don't know.
They're like, technically indigenous folks that we colonized.
Like, exactly. Like they should probably be their own disambiguated category. Right. And like Asian American disaggregated data is like a whole other conversation that has to happen. But like I want to pause for a moment and like recognize it as a conversation.
Person of Southeast Asian as well.
Right,
as Asian
exactly.
Descent. It's like,
I guess if we talk about like Asian youth mentorship, then let's like go with the more broad or less I don't know if it's more broad necessarily, but like a vague term. That if we, for example, in my case, let's say I was like specifically trying to create like an East Asian youth mentorship network, which I'm not. The whole point of our network that I'm trying to build is like to try and break down barriers. But let's say I did want to do like a more focused program.
Right.
I do think that like in the case, for example, let's say within this wider program that we're working on, that we do try to pair, that some people want pairings that match them across like similar backgrounds. And I think there's value in that, right? Like if people request that, I would actually probably try to match them that way. So let's say I was mentoring someone who was a lot like my past self. I do think that a key consideration would be to bring up that triangulation of like the model minority myth, because it's not something that we're taught in schools. It's not something that you even think about when you go to a school that's like majority Asian, because when you go to a school and you grow up in a community that's majority Asian, that's your default. Like my default existence in my head is an Asian American person. Like when I think of a default human being, it's an Asian American person, because that's what I grew up with. Just like 87% of the people around me were Asian American, specifically, actually, largely East Asian even. So that's what I was used to. So it's a conversation that has to happen. So I guess the point is that we have to, in any kind of like Asian youth mentorship, we have to point out our place in the white supremacy narrative, that we are not devoid of responsibility in this history, and that we do have to actively take action to be anti-racist, right? To be actively anti-racist and not just like not a racist. In our work in the system is like that we have to actually work in it, instead of just being passive, like, oh, well, I'm a person of color, so I am like excluded from, I don't know, whatever.
I can't be racist because I don't see color.
Exactly. Like I don't see color. We're like, I am a person of color, therefore I can't be racist. Like that's all bull crap. Like we all saw, for example, with Crazy Rich Asians.
Oh God.
How wrong it can go.
Yeah. I mean, freaking.
I have not yet watched.
I mean, like, so I really like my ideal state is that we can exist in a world where Crazy Rich Asians is okay, because we have so many other examples of good, like more diverse kinds of representation in our media. So the Crazy Rich Asians is just one facet of it, because it's not like untrue. Like it's not that it doesn't exist. It does, but it's just like the fact that it is the only representation we have, I think says a lot about
for like 20, 30 years.
Exactly.
It's not even like a 100%. Whole representation of Singapore too, but whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. And honestly, okay, I guess as a quick tangential point, the books actually do a much better job.
I read the books.
The books are actually quite good, and the books are written to be satirical. And the movie didn't feel as satirical. Yeah. So a lot of stuff missing in translation there, but the books were actually quite enjoyable. I did really like them.
You're supposed to like laugh at the decadence, not celebrate it.
Right. Yeah. The whole point is to mock it. And also the books do also like humanize the people in it. Right. So like the decadence is not like the people who are living in it are also affected by it in negative ways. Yeah.
Which is a good take. Not what the movie was on.
Oh, absolutely not. No, the movie did change some other things that were interesting in a way that I would describe as being kind of girl boss, gatekeep. What's the third one? Gaslight.
Oh.
Like,
I like that. I like that. I never heard that before. That's a good term.
It's like a huge meme on Twitter right now. Oh, really? I think the correct order is gaslight, girl boss, gatekeep. Like,
I mean, that makes sense, right? First you gaslight, and then you make sure nobody else can freaking do any of that.
Yeah.
Terrible.
The Holy Trinity.
Yeah. Oh God.
We are living in changing times. You see people taking stuff that are satirical of, say, Nazis and being actual Nazis. You see gentrification right before your eyes. But on topic, how has youth mentorship changed before your eyes?
Yeah, I guess my experience with it would be like as a mentee and then shifting more into like mentor roles over time. I honestly think that like the core of mentorship is never going to change, right? The thing that I do see a lot of is that there's a sort of an industry focus on mentorship. This concept that I think especially in like women in tech spaces, you'll hear it a lot. And I understand that like women in tech it's a complicated space for me because I identify as non-binary, specifically agender. And so I kind of fit into kind of a weird place when it comes to women in tech because it's relevant to me because people read me as a woman. Like I look and largely present, I guess, question mark. I don't know what presenting means anymore, but like people read me as a cis woman. I often do not correct them because it has no effect on anything.
Some of my friends have used the phrase, some of my NB friends have used the phrase, I'm politically a woman.
Yeah. Like I'm politically a woman. And so I continue to participate in women in tech spaces because it's relevant. Like I have a relevant like perspective to offer there, and things to learn as well from fellow women in tech. So in that space, mentorship has been an evolving discussion, because I think for a while, I want to say again that maybe Sheryl Sandberg's, again, I have complicated feelings about like Sheryl Sandberg's whole lean in thing.
Wait, what is
in that like Sheryl Sandberg wrote a book called Lean In that I have very complicated feelings about and have never been able to finish reading because it makes me feel so tangled. I don't think this was her purpose, but I do think like, I don't think she intentionally did this, but I do think that a lot of her narrative kind of places the onus on women to like step up and lean in and like take a seat at the table and like speak up, you know, like, why aren't you speaking up? Is sort of like the accusatory tone that I think I think she didn't mean. I genuinely think that she didn't mean to do this. But that's sort of like, that's the fallout. Like that is actually what happened after she wrote that book, because people are like, yeah, we should like, if you want to be a successful woman in tech, you should speak up, like talk louder, negotiate harder, which I don't think is the solution. But again, you know, it takes all kinds. You got to chip at the wall from every angle. And so like, if that works for you, then that's great. Like, I hope it continues to work for you.
Yeah, I've heard lean in feminism, which is non-intersectional white feminism.
Lean in feminism. It's like, lean in feminism has a lot of turfs, is what I'll say.
Yeah. It's the quintessential girl boss book.
Oh God. Yeah. It's a very girl boss mentality. Exactly. Yeah. And so I actually think that a lot of the narrative around mentorship and women in tech has been driven by a lot of people who like buy into the girl boss narrative.
I can see that.
Right. And the girl boss narrative is very systemic, right? It's very procedural. It means that like mentorship to them means setting up mentorship networks where we have you fill out a Google form about what you're interested in and try to pair you with other people who have similar interests. And maybe are like farther down the specific path that you want to walk. But my experience over time has been that my path has diverged many times, and that my mentor, despite that, has been an incredible asset to me because they're able to offer their life perspectives on the path that they've walked and the ways that their paths have diverged. And so instead of this very like sort of prescriptive way of looking at mentorship, I feel like over time, as people have participated in more of these very structural programs, that they're starting to see that it's a little bit too restrictive. And people are moving towards more organic methods of mentorship. And so now when you attend conferences that maybe there's a talk about women in tech or something and like mentoring women in tech, you'll hear a lot more speakers talk about how you really have to find like sponsors, I think is like the word that people are starting to use now, that you look for mentors who organically you connect with. And it's not about like messaging people to be like, hi, will you please be my mentor? But rather that like you sort of naturally connect with certain people because you have like similar energy or shared momentum in some way. So rather than trying to, and of course, like not everybody can do that. Like not everybody is wired to organically reach out to people, or you may not have the luck necessary even to meet people who you jive with. And so like these structural mentorship programs can help you in situations like that, but you have to go outside of those networks and like find people you connect with who may not be in your industry or may not come from a similar background as you. And to make those connections, those interdisciplinary, intergenerational, inter everything connections.
Intersectional. How about that?
Sectional even. I feel like even intersectional is a little bit limiting, that it's very disciplinary, right?
Oh yeah.
So inter everything, that you cross all kinds of boundaries to find people who are different from you actually, but who still share your values, and to treat those people as your mentors. And again, like that mentorship is not a single direction, right? Like people who have been my mentors before, I have been, I think, a source of mentorship for them as well as things have unfolded and our paths have changed. So like, it's not a one-way street. Like mentorship is a relationship between two people where you both are contributing to each other's worldviews and like evolving over time together. It's a growth process that you engage in together. And so I think that's the shift that I've started to see happen. And I'm really excited for it actually, because I'm hoping that, I think there's a tendency to bias towards having more structured programs. And that's, I think, a good thing for the most part. But I'm hoping that as we value these organic connections more, that people will become more, I think, intentional about them and like aware of them. Because that's going back again to the very beginning, what we were saying about like networks of giving, that this is that being intentional about your giving is what causes these networks to build up. Otherwise, you're just kind of like giving into the void. So that's sort of the direction that I'm hoping it's moving into, that we're part of a community that gives to each other instead of like a specific mentorship generational chain that gives downward in a single direction. Yeah.
Yeah, I really agree with that in terms of the organic relationships of both directions, because I mean that is what the open source community does. It's not like
Yeah.
you have to
Yeah.
listen
Open
to
source
me.
is a great example of a community that just like gives and gives and gives and gives and
Yeah.
never seems to stop. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I think like that's a lot of exciting things, especially that probably the stuff like the girl boss things that you're mentioning is like the beginning, and then we kind of move away from that in terms of the structure, organizational wise, etc., to more of this organic thing approach, because it kind of feels like the history of urban planning, and this is my background, right? So it's like, you know, planners used to think that everything should be grid pattern and stuff like that, and then they took that to the next level with the suburbs, and like, okay, we're going to make all these cul-de-sacs that are just
Copy paste.
yeah, exactly. And then, but now you have someone like Jane Jacobs, who is another great urban planner back in New York, basically saying cities can't be planned because the real important cities around the world are the ones that organically grow, depending on the
Yes.
community. And so
Those are my favorite. Yeah.
yeah, like, you know, Rome, Paris, all these places weren't deliberately like, you know, created. It was a fabric of different patchwork. And
Yeah, yeah. You look at most downtowns and they look chaotic, right? Like the big cities I'm most familiar with are Boston or Shanghai, and they both sort of evolved from like little fishing villages, basically. So they all have like really weird intersections that are like star shaped and like pointy, and the buildings are pointy on that particular intersection because you have to fit onto the weird shaped block, question mark, is it even a block? But like it's the chaos of these areas of like old town Shanghai and old Boston that like really give it character and like give it a sense of like history. Like these are the roads that our ancestors walked and built and evolved. Yeah. And that's why we're here now. Yeah,
exactly.
My sibling and I were reading a book called, I forgot what it was called, but one of the terms was like high modernism, where it's this authoritarian ideology with when it comes to urban planning, where you look at it from the sky rather than walk it. So it's like straight lines and easy for traffic, but unhealthy for people.
Yep. I mean, I hate modernism as a urban planning. Like, so Lewis Mumford can go suck it. This is my my podcast message, my last one. That
we have a few modernist buildings on our college campus too.
Oh my god! Right? Like he took over. Like they're just so ugly. Like, I mean, in my opinion.
That's true. Beauty is very subjective.
But
I'm not much of a modern urban society person either, because it's like everything's just boxy and gray.
Yeah, exactly. It's function over form. Sorry. Anyways.
Well, so then I guess I'm curious about like in terms of, for example, affordable housing that's being built, and it tends to, you know, become more of that boxy archetype for like efficiency's sake. How do you feel about the evolution of that?
Oh, well, I mean, honestly, the affordable housing is basically rich white people thinking of what's the most efficient way to house poor people, then instead of like actually trying to figure out what the
boxes
exactly, which is like,
boxes,
right? And it's happening again with like modular buildings.
Yes. Oh god, yeah.
And homeless boxes.
Yeah, that's like a huge thing happening in the Bay Area right now. Like there's
in LA too.
Yeah,
we're trying to do boxes, literally just sleeping boxes for homeless people, and it's like
it's the same thing. I'm going to go back to what I mentioned earlier about like trying to apply technology across the board without thinking about the social impacts, because you know, if you're trying to help people and you're just applying, whether it's programming tools or, you know, housing construction, it's like you have to listen to the community if you're actually going to help them. And
and the community should be not just involved in the process but driving it.
Exactly. And that's my modus operandi when it comes to mentorship, in terms of like if you're ever in a position of giving, it's always important to understand that it's not a top-down approach, which is why I really resonated with what you're saying about like it's about because you can't sustain it either. Like if you want to make mentorship all about like, I'm just giving you tools,
I'm just like force feeding you information.
I would say that's morally bankrupt. I mean, because you're essentially you're thinking that you know everything, which is it's a pretty egotistical proclamation, I think, and it's something that is always changing. I mean, knowledge is fickle. What we know today is different than tomorrow, and so to think that whatever tools you're teaching is the right way to do things, and that's why every school is institutional. And I do think that a lot of professors, and I'm really gonna get some people yelling at me, but I would say a lot of professors are kind of part of that institution to not make change because they're comfortable with where they are. And it's the whole notion of why a PhD is so hard to get, because you go through this process of like basically, it's funny, it's indoctrinization in a way too.
Indoctrinization.
Exactly.
Oh no. Fun.
But yeah, it's because in order to be a PhD person, you have to buy into the system and really crush your your ability to understand that things aren't always what they seem, and you could be wrong. But no, it's like you have to pretend that you are right, and your field of study so much that you're like
Oh man, yeah, we see the same phenomenon in politics, right?
Yes.
That a lot of people who start with good intentions end up like by the time you're able to game the system so that you could do anything meaningful, you're also fully bought into the system.
Yeah.
And so in many ways it's too late for you. And so it's a catch-22, right? And I grappled with that myself. Like if I didn't win my election, but like if I had won my election, it's something that I definitely would have been thinking about constantly. Is like, how do I act in a system that I don't agree with in a meaningful way that will still create change without me losing sight of my original purpose. Yeah.
Okay, so last point, and you can make this quick if you want. How can listeners support this empowerment of students from at-risk and minority communities?
Yeah, action is the most important thing. I just spent yesterday ranting with a friend about how a lot of people we talk about like social media, like social justice warriors, I guess, like keyboard warriors. Like all you do is you care about what you look like, basically. So you're out here tweeting or Facebook posting or whatever about Black Lives Matter, or like you show up at a protest and you take some selfies and you post them and you leave, that is not showing up. Showing up is much more boring than that. Showing up to me means going to your city council meetings and like hearing what the hell they're up to this time. And they're like city planning shenanigans that you probably don't agree with. And like speaking up during public comment about what you disagree with, and like holding your elected officials accountable by being in their face and like telling them and making it very obvious that you are listening and you are watching them, because that's the only thing that's going to change their action, is if they realize that like we're watching, because otherwise city council and school board just do whatever the hell they want. And so really, I know it's a really boring thing to ask of people, but that like you should go to your city council meetings, to your school board meetings. You should skim the agenda. I know it looks dense, but just like skim it really quick, right? Like what is on the table? Oh, they're talking about school resource officers. That's a big thing. Do we want cops on our campuses? How do I feel about that? What am I going to say during public comment about our decision here? Like you really make your voice heard if you are in a position to do so, right? Thinking about the people that you are trying to not really represent, but like to elevate the voices of people who may not have your privileges, who may not be able to attend these school board meetings because they might be working, 3 jobs or something, or like taking care of their kids because childcare is super expensive. Like thinking really intentionally and acting intentionally about what kind of change you want to see. Who are the people in your community that you are trying to uplift? Are you genuinely understanding their situation? Are you really amplifying their voices in a meaningful way, or are you just kind of stroking your own ego? And like being very careful about that, because it's very easy to relapse into the whole I'm stroking my own ego thing without realizing it. Activism has to be consistent, and it has to be community driven. So these are all things when I ask people to do these things, I'm not saying that you should do it alone. More important than anything else is to find your people who are also interested in doing this, and then to do it together. So I guess if there are any Bay Area listeners, a really exciting thing that's happened in recent months. Honestly, I guess it really kicked off. It's existed for a long time, but really kicked off with the resurgence of the BLM movement in June this past year, was our Engage Fremont coalition. We call it Engage Fremont. And I'm starting to see similar coalitions spring up around the Bay. So it's a community-driven coalition that involves lots of different coalition members. And the coalition members, just as an example of the Engage Fremont case, includes our Fremont LGBTQ+ task force. It includes our student activists. There are 2 student activist groups. It can include our teachers union if they would like to participate more. And we do have like individual teachers union members joining our cause. and it just like, it goes on, right? Like anyone can be part of the coalition, and we are very intersectional in our operations, I guess. So what do we do? Like, sure, we have a presence on social media, but our goal of the social media outlets is to like inform and educate and like enable people to reduce the barriers of entry when it comes to showing up to public comment, for example, which is, it can be a very daunting thing. Like, I'm not saying it's easy. It's really scary the first time you show up to school board meeting to make it's so stressful. Yeah. And so to try to make it like a more welcoming community where you feel like you're supported and we're all in this together, you know? So like in our case, for Engage Fremont's case, we're all on Slack, like screaming with each other whenever there's a school board meeting that we're all showing up at. And so you don't feel so alone, like you're not alone in this battle, right? So find your community of advocates and organizers and organize, like really turn people out and show up. And this is rich coming from me because I kind of burned out and I had to step away for a moment. But I will be back, right? Like I'm fully intending to jump back in. And I have endless respect for the people who don't burn out, and I don't know how they do it. I'm still trying to figure that out myself.
It's a balance. I mean, yeah, you can't. It's the same thing with giving. With what you're saying about with mentorship, mental health is very as much important as an activist. Then you know, because I mean, it goes back to the first episode with Claire Lau, who's the co-founder of SF Berniecrats, and she really was talking about how people should get involved, but also understand that we have to balance that with our own personal goals. What we want to do with our lives, and
like know your limits. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Know your limits, and I think also like set expectations with your fellow organizers, right? Like make it really clear how much I'm able to contribute, and like if I go beyond this, I will burn out. Exactly. So like that's what I'm trying to figure out for myself right now. Yep. The other thing that I'm realizing as I'm like sort of reflecting on like why I burned out so quickly. I mean, it wasn't that quick. I guess I literally ran a campaign, which I don't know how I did that, but I'm realizing that my motivations were coming a lot from a place of like guilt and obligation. So I was feeling like I was obligated to give back to this community. So instead of coming out of a place of sort of like love and mentorship and like wanting to build up something, I was sort of showing up because I was scared that if I didn't show up, that I was not worthy of being part of this community. And like, I think it's easy to lapse into that kind of like a negative mindset. So it's really important to course correct yourself and think really seriously about like why you're doing certain things. And like not every action that is actionable is going to be suitable for everyone. So like maybe showing up to every single public comment was not the best way for me to be taking action. Like maybe building up this mentorship network that I keep talking about will be a better way for me to invest my energy. Everyone has a different part to play. Yep. I think the important part is that you are doing something. So, and not just doing something alone, but doing something as part of an organizing like entity, like a body that is moving together. So,
and
I completely feel you in that whole guilt and if I don't do something, thing. I feel like that's a very like Asian raised sort of mental mindset that we get stuck into as organizers, and it just we have to recognize it and like slowly take it out of our system.
We have to recognize that it's counterproductive. It's not doing what we think it's doing. Like guilt tripping people to show up is not doing what you think it's doing.
No, and honestly, it's not sustainable. I mean,
exactly.
Like Rex was saying earlier, like these institutions didn't build themselves overnight, and so similarly, these organizations, they exist to make organizing easier, right? They're not, and it's a way to keep that mentorship spirit in both the youth mentorship that you're talking about, but also in the spirit of kind of breaking down all these silos and barriers that are popped up in place to kind of support things like white supremacy.
And the last thing I will also want to bring up is that I think that anyone who's first getting into this, like it's easy for me to say like find your organizers, like find your people, but it's harder to actually do that. And so like a question I get a lot is like, well, how do I do that? Like, how do I find the local organizers who are doing things? And I honestly think that it starts with showing up. So like show up as an individual first. Hear the names that like usually people introduce themselves by name as they start their public comment. Like start to pay attention to what names consistently show up. Like who are the people who are always there? Reach out to those people and ask like, are you part of like a more concerted effort? Like, is there, I don't know, a Slack group, a Discord server, a Facebook chat that I can be part of where you're organizing together? And like you just need to find one or two people and eventually someone will be able to point you in the right direction, because I don't think there exists a single place where there is no one trying to do something.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that too, it's picking the battles that you want to fight on. Like,
oh yeah, choose the topics the things that matter to you personally.
I'm not very especially good at the public comment stuff, and when I go, I need a lot of support. I'm better at the stuff that isn't mentioned.
So like maybe you can help. Like there are lots of other skill sets, right? Like we need people to be running the social media, we need people to be writing emails, like we do this.
You gotta go find materials. You gotta.
But what matters is you do what you can. And maybe public comment isn't for everyone, but I hope that even people who really don't like it will show up for the ones that really matter, right? Like, so for example, when the SRO debate was raging in Fremont, we had a lot of people show up to speak who usually are not comfortable speaking. And I think we see that in each other and we appreciate it. It means a lot.
Definitely. Well, those are some really good points to leave off on, and it's actually a great kind of return to the beginnings of the podcast, because it is, we were trying to figure out, how do listeners get active and how do you sustain that without burning out? And mentorship is a great way to pass that baton over to both the people and the mentor and mentee. So
mentorship is a two-way street. I feel like that's like that's like the title.
The title, yeah, exactly. And I agree with that. And it's not looked at and like that often, I think, because of even the terms mentor, mentee, whatever.
It feels directional.
Exactly. So I really appreciate the time that you took to come on the show to talk about that. Any other comments you'd like to make?
No, just that it was an honor being here, and it was great talking to you both and hearing your thoughts about everything. I feel like I've been radicalized through this podcast.
Thanks. No, I really appreciate the work that you've done, and it's always like inspiring to hear from candidates and people who've also put on campaigns, because like that's part of the showing up that you're talking about, and it's important to recognize that it's a huge effort. I mean, it's not an easy task to get out, put your name out there, and get people to get on to quote unquote your side or whatever, because it's
and I mean, we also disagree a lot, right? We all stand from our own positions and have our own opinions, and exactly. You're not always 100% aligned, but what matters is your end vision is aligned, and so you're willing to put aside whatever disagreements and work towards that together.
Diversity of tactics is where we can all agree on. So
absolutely,
that's our agreement.
Exactly. Thank you so much again, Lucy, for coming on the show.
And thank you for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of WhatsApp. Remember to like, subscribe, or follow. Be sure to leave a comment, because we always look forward to feedback and enjoy hearing what our listeners have to say.